2 hours after delivery in the high-security maternity pavilion overlooking the Savannah International Container Terminal, I expected my husband to hold our newborn daughter. Instead, Julian Sterling stood motionless in his bespoke navy suit, evaluating the infant like an administrative error. He leaned down and whispered that he had already fathered a son with Serena Cole. He dropped a ruthless separation agreement onto the sterile bed, threatening to bury me in years of fabricated litigation if I didn't immediately sign away all financial rights for our newborn. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. Julian had entered my life the way incredibly expensive things always do, quietly, seamlessly, and demanding total maintenance. 4 years ago, I, Clara Vance, was a forensic corporate auditor, accustomed to untangling complex financial liabilities, hunting down hidden assets, and finding the rot beneath the glossy surface of billion-dollar companies. Julian was the golden heir to Sterling Logistics. Our marriage wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was a corporate merger. I just hadn't realized until this exact moment that I was the hostile acquisition. I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of a family, footing the emotional bill with my blind compliance, while they reaped the social dividends. His parents, Arthur and Evelyn Sterling, were the quintessential old money patriarch and matriarch who ran their dynasty like a locked boardroom. To them, I was never a daughter-in-law. I was a completely interchangeable outsider, a temporary placeholder to stabilize Julian's image while they finished preparing him for the upcoming board succession review. They never bothered to truly hide their underlying hostility. Evelyn's tight smiles never reached her eyes, and Arthur treated my presence at the dinner table like a minor tax penalty he was legally forced to endure. I absorbed their daily slights the way a clean ledger absorbs a deficit, quietly compiling the data without reacting. People always expect a woman betrayed in a sterile hospital bed to break down. They expect the frantic screaming, the hot tears, the hysterical bargaining of a shattered heart. But when severe trauma hits, true survivors do not shatter. We freeze. It is the invisible armor of the overlooked. When you spend your life being systematically dismissed by the people who are supposed to protect you, you learn very quickly that panic is a luxury you simply cannot afford. Hysteria only gives the enemy ammunition. Silence gives you absolute control. It is a deeply ingrained psychological survival mechanism where the brain entirely bypasses grief and instantly initiates a cold threat assessment. You stop being a victim and become an observer. I did not cry. I did not ask him why he was doing this. I did not beg for an explanation. I just looked at the man who had casually erased our entire family and started calculating the absolute cost of his breach of contract. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was incredibly clinical. I rubbed my eyes, perhaps trying to summon a shred of regret, but there was only crystalline clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Julian had just handed me the final, irrefutable audit of our marriage. Every fake smile, every skipped dinner, every lie was now categorized and verified. I realized that his love had been nothing more than a temporary subscription, and my trial period had just expired. He thought my stillness was submission. He didn't realize I was simply gathering the data required to liquidate him. I pulled my daughter closer to my chest, feeling the steady, fragile rhythm of her breathing. I looked up at Julian, taking in the smug, untouchable set of his jaw. Then I smiled. It wasn't a smile of forgiveness. It was the smile of an auditor who had just found the fatal discrepancy in the accounts. I leaned in and whispered a warning of absolute finality. I told him he had just made the most expensive miscalculation of his life. Julian actually laughed. He chuckled, a short, patronizing sound that echoed off the sterile walls of the maternity pavilion. He patted my shoulder with detached condescension, assuming my threat was nothing more than hormonal postpartum exhaustion. He told me to get some rest, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out the door, believing he had won. He thought he had cleanly excised a liability. He had no idea he had just initiated a war. Lying there in the quiet room, the pieces of the past 4 years finally clicked into a cohesive pattern. The warning signs hadn't been sudden explosions. They had been quiet, systematic shifts in his behavior. I thought back to the late-night calls taken in the driveway. The glowing screen of his phone hastily flipped face down on the kitchen island. I remembered the sudden, unexplained extensions of his international business trips, supposedly to negotiate shipping routes that never seemed to materialize on the quarterly reports. And then there was the chilling, omnipresent shadow of Serena Cole. She wasn't just his executive assistant, she was the architect of his daily life. Serena had always moved through the Sterling Logistics headquarters with an unearned authority, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floors like a metronome counting down the days of my marriage. She had orchestrated his schedules, managed his access, and curated his public image. Now I realized she had been curating a completely different life for him off the books. I had trusted the spreadsheets he showed me, ignoring the obvious off-balance sheet transactions happening right in front of my face. My husband hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been running a parallel corporate structure, shifting his loyalty and his legacy to a secret partner. The betrayal didn't sting, it simply validated my new objective. They thought they had outsmarted the auditor. They thought my love for Julian would make me blind to the operational shifts in his routine. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. You can falsify the daily reports all you want, but the final audit always reveals the truth. I didn't waste a single second wishing things were different. The data was in. The fraud was confirmed. My marriage was a shell company, and it was time to pierce the corporate veil. As the hospital monitors beeped softly in the background, I opened my laptop. I didn't look for divorce attorneys. I looked for corporate bylaws. The retaliation wouldn't be loud, but it would be absolute. By the time midnight rolled around, I had finished crying the tears I never actually shed. The emotional deficit was cleared. It was time to start the asset recovery. Julian remained entirely absent for the next 24 hours. He was securely tucked away at his parents' estate, frantically managing the fallout of Serena's mounting demands. While he cowered behind the gates of his dynasty, my fierce older sister Gwen drove down from Atlanta at breakneck speed. She breached the hospital room like a tactical strike force, instantly taking over. Gwen ruthlessly managed the nursing staff to ensure my pain medications were always on time, and stood guard at the door, ensuring no unwanted Sterling representatives could cross the threshold. During the deep, quiet hours of that second night, while my daughter slept and Gwen kept watch in the armchair, my phone vibrated. It was a delayed call from Victoria Thorne. Victoria was not just a lawyer. She was the elite estate attorney for my late maternal great-uncle Ezekiel Hayes. Decades ago, Ezekiel had been a master shipping architect. He had literally spent his life designing the vast structural foundations and logistical networks that allowed Sterling Logistics to become a global titan. I answered the call, my voice steady, my mind processing data at maximum capacity. Before Victoria even spoke, my thoughts drifted to the sheer, mechanical coldness of the Sterling family's actions. It is a psychological phenomenon known as the trap of sanitized cruelty. When people exist inside the airtight bubble of dynastic wealth, they become completely insulated from basic human empathy. Money creates a buffer that filters out the messy, emotional reality of other people's pain. To families like the Sterlings, human beings cease to be living, breathing entities. We become nothing more than balance sheet liabilities. They didn't look at my newborn daughter and see a child. They saw an administrative hurdle. They saw a potential drain on future dividends, a complication in the line of succession that needed to be swiftly managed and erased. Their cruelty wasn't born of fiery hatred. It was born of sterile, corporate indifference. They sanitized their damage with checkbooks and legal threats, convincing themselves that because they aren't physically violent, they aren't monsters. But a knife to the back is no less lethal just because the handle is made of solid gold. Victoria's voice on the line was sharp and urgent. She bypassed all pleasantries and demanded to know my exact legal standing with Julian. I gave her the raw facts. No hesitation, no emotional filler, just the data of his betrayal and his refusal to acknowledge the child. I heard the rustle of heavy parchment paper over the line. Victoria paused, letting the silence stretch for 3 beats before she spoke again. Her words cut through the dark hospital room like a scalpel. She told me that the Sterlings had made a fatal error in their estate planning. They were so focused on securing Julian's future that they had completely neglected to audit their own past. They weren't shocked by what they had done to me. They were about to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I sat up in the hospital bed, the pain in my body entirely eclipsed by the adrenaline of incoming leverage. The conversation shifted from personal tragedy to professional strategy. This wasn't going to be a messy, tearful divorce. It was going to be a hostile takeover. The truth poured out of my phone speaker, methodical and utterly devastating. Victoria Thorne revealed that great-uncle Ezekiel had visited her office exactly 1 year before his death. He hadn't come to reminisce about the past. He had come to meticulously review an old, deeply buried partnership agreement that he had secretly folded into the bedrock of Sterling logistics decades prior. Ezekiel wasn't just a brilliant shipping architect. He was a visionary who fundamentally understood the relentless greed of the men he worked alongside. To protect his legacy from their inevitable corruption, he had hidden a failsafe. Victoria explained that this ancient, legally binding contract contained an active voting agreement directly tied to a 15% stake in the company's core development arm. 15%. In the cutthroat corporate world, it was the skeleton key to the entire shipping empire. But the leverage didn't stop there. Victoria, operating with the clinical precision of a forensic surgeon, had uncovered a massive structural redundancy in the company's current financial filings. In his arrogant, reckless haste to build a parallel life, Julian had initiated secret, unauthorized offshore asset transfers with Serena Cole's family. He thought he was cleverly hiding his wealth from me. Instead, he had unknowingly tripped an inescapable legal wire. Those specific international transfers violated the original operational covenants established by Ezekiel, instantly triggering an automatic charter forfeiture clause. By illegally trying to steal his future, Julian had completely forfeited his present. The sheer, mathematical elegance of his impending destruction was almost beautiful. I didn't smile. I didn't gasp in shock. I simply logged the data. The power dynamic hadn't just slightly shifted. It had completely inverted overnight. I thanked Victoria, hung up the phone, and looked down at my peacefully sleeping daughter. I silently promised her she would never have to beg for a place at their table, because we were going to own the entire boardroom. The next 48 hours were executed with absolute tactical ruthlessness. There was no dramatic, weeping confrontation at the sprawling Sterling estate. There were no angry letters left on the kitchen counter. While I recovered in bed with my newborn, Gwen hired a discreet team of movers who systematically packed my life into identical brown boxes. I erased my physical presence from Julian's world as efficiently as formatting a corrupted hard drive. With Gwen's relentless help, I moved into a modest, highly secure rental property tucked away on the quiet outskirts of Savannah. It was a calculated, strategic retreat, securing my most valuable assets before launching the offensive. Once my daughter was safe and my new location was locked down, I opened my laptop. I drafted a formal, heavily documented request for a comprehensive executive conduct review. I meticulously attached the undeniable evidence of the offshore transfers and cited the binding terms of Ezekiel's partnership agreement. I sent the packet directly to the board of directors of Sterling Logistics. I completely bypassed Julian. I bypassed Arthur. I went straight to the governing body that controlled their wealth. I didn't ask for a meager divorce settlement. I initiated a corporate tribunal. The email sent notification chimed softly in the quiet rental house. It was the distinct sound of a guillotine dropping. My retaliation was never going to be a screaming match in a driveway. It was accounting. Pure, cold, unadulterated accounting. They had deliberately tried to erase my daughter's name. Now, they were going to pay the ultimate, crushing cost for mine. The emergency board meeting convened 72 hours later in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, high above the sprawling Savannah container yards. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my posture straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of professional detachment. Julian sat opposite me, looking like a man who had just realized the parachute he packed was full of anvils. Arthur Sterling paced the length of the room, his face flushed with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. For the first time in his life, Arthur wasn't directing his fury at me. He turned entirely on his golden heir. In front of the entire board of directors, Arthur mercilessly questioned Julian regarding his stability certifications. He demanded to know how Julian could have recklessly engineered a secret family while simultaneously violating the core charter of the very company he was supposed to inherit. The room was thick with the scent of burning legacies. Serena Cole sat 2 chairs down from Julian. She had arrived, expecting to be crowned the new queen of the Sterling dynasty. Instead, she spent the meeting watching her carefully constructed future vaporize into thin air. As the undeniable documentation of the charter forfeiture was projected onto the screen, reality finally breached Serena's delusion. She realized she was never a partner. She was merely another expendable pawn in Julian's pathetic performance of power. When the mediator officially confirmed the forfeiture clause, Serena stood up. She smoothed her tailored skirt, looked down at Julian with absolute disgust, and delivered a devastating final sentence. "You told me you owned the world, Julian. Turns out, you don't even own yourself." She turned on her heel and walked out of the glass room, severing their illicit partnership with the slam of the heavy door. The board voted unanimously to immediately suspend Julian's executive powers, completely freezing his access to all corporate assets and initiating an independent external audit prior to full financial liquidation. The meeting adjourned in a heavy, suffocating silence. I packed my documents into my briefcase, every movement precise and unhurried. As I made my way to the mirrored elevator lobby, Julian cornered me. His bespoke suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled. He looked desperate, pathetic, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had always defined him. "You orchestrated all of this," he hissed, his voice trembling with impotent rage. "You tore down my entire life. I didn't step back. I didn't flinch." I looked at my former husband with absolute clinical calm. He wasn't a threat anymore. He was a closed account. "I didn't tear anything down, Julian," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet echoing off the mirrored walls. "I just audited the foundation." "You're the one who built it on sand," the elevator chimed, the polished steel doors sliding open to reveal my escape route. I stepped inside, turning around to face him one last time. He reached a hand out, a desperate, futile gesture, but the doors closed, slicing his reflection in half. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor, my heart beating with the steady rhythm of pure liberation. I walked out of the building and stepped into the blinding afternoon sunlight, where Gwen was waiting by the SUV. I took my daughter from her arms, holding her peacefully against my chest. The air smelled like salt and victory. The aftermath was a masterclass in relentless legal execution. Following 4 agonizing months of intense legal depositions, the mediator finally issued the binding ruling. The verdict was absolute. My daughter was granted formal, irrevocable inheritance standing as the only child born within a valid, legally recorded marriage. Serena's son, born of fraud and hidden assets, remained entirely outside the corporate succession structure. Julian was systematically stripped of his titles. He lost his executive position, his corner office, and his access to the family's unlimited capital. Stripped of his wealth, his true nature emerged hollow, lazy, and entirely incapable of sustaining effort. Within a year, his court-ordered visitation schedules completely lapsed due to his own pathetic negligence. He couldn't be bothered to show up for a child who didn't come with a trust fund attached. Arthur Sterling reached out to me years later. We met on neutral ground, a quiet coffee shop far from the Savannah docks. The arrogant patriarch had withered into a tired, broken old man. Staring into his lukewarm coffee, Arthur finally admitted the truth. He confessed how his own father's clinical coldness had poisoned their family tree for generations, turning their bloodline into a transactional nightmare. I listened to his confession without anger, but also without granting him the absolution he so desperately sought. I simply paid for his coffee and walked away. leaving him to the quiet misery of his empty mansion. I took the power and capital that Ezekiel Hayes had secured and channeled it into something that actually mattered. I established the Ezekiel Hayes Foundation. We didn't build shipping containers. We built safety nets. The foundation provided aggressive legal support and financial backing for single mothers and victims of systemic corporate exploitation. I made absolutely certain that the wealth generated by the docks would be used to ensure that future generations of women would never have to beg to be chosen. They would never have to negotiate for their basic human dignity. We took the Sterling Empire's money and used it to dismantle the very type of cruelty they had championed. Looking back on the sterile hospital room where it all began, I realize now that my stillness wasn't just shock. It was the gathering of a storm. When they tried to break me, they handed me the exact tools I needed to forge an unbreakable future for my daughter. I've come to realize that the most profound justice doesn't come from matching your enemy's screaming rage. It comes from outsmarting their cruelty. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the wreckage they left behind. I didn't forgive Julian by welcoming him back. I forgave him by making his existence completely irrelevant to my joy. If you were in that hospital bed with a promise breaking apart right in front of you, would you have smiled the way Clara did? Or would you have let him see exactly what you were feeling in that moment? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story on how real justice is built.